Namaste and welcome everyone to Atharva Forum. Before we begin, please subscribe to the Atharva Forum YouTube channel. Now, today on this talk, we'll be spending time trying to understand an underappreciated and understudied aspect of Jatis in India. So, this aspect is really that of interdependencies between various Jatis, of patron Jatis, of performing artist Jatis, and of Jatis that belong to various narrative traditions that carry on the narratives on Jati Puranas, Kula Puranas, etc. The focus, particularly in this talk, will be on a lot of Jatis in the Telangana region from where I belong. However, there are instances of such kinds of practices being prevalent across multiple states all over the country in some form or the other. So you can find these kind of performing jati or narrative traditions of various jatis, not just in Telangana. You will find it in Andhra Pradesh, in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, Rajasthan, West Bengal, Uttarakhand, Manipur, Gujarat, pretty much all over the country. Now, as I mentioned, this talk is really on jatis, and the reason why we are doing this talk today is to make an attempt to understand our cultural past and understand caste or jatis through a prism that is very different from the usual. Now, there is one prism of looking at caste, which is quite prevalent across academia, across media, everywhere else, which is to see it as a off-quoted four Varna model or a hierarchy model with certain castes on top, and then there is an exploiter, exploited, oppressor, oppressed, that kind of an equation that is built in. Now, while that may be perhaps one way of looking at castes, there is another aspect of looking at jatis, which is the living entities as practiced in the Indian cultural realm, where there is another, perhaps a different perspective of looking at these jatis, of their interrelationships, of the interdependencies, particularly of the art forms that are prevalent across multiple jatis, and how these art forms give meaning to many other jatis. The attempt is really to understand this part of our Hindu cultural past and present, and then to understand how we carry this past and present to the Hindu cultural future. Now, it is difficult to imagine anything on Hindu cultural continuity without a due consideration and understanding of the complex interrelationships between various jatis. So, in some way, we can also say that the Hindu cultural experience is really a conglomeration of various jati cultural experiences. Now, the reason why I delve upon so much on the past aspect of this whole cultural experience is also because, as Mircea Eliade, who is one of the foremost and well-respected cultural historian and comparative historian, he made this statement quite some time ago in one of his works that past lingers. So, past lingers for us and past lingers for everyone. Do what he will, Eliade says. Do what he will. The profane man is an inheritor. He cannot utterly abolish his past, since he himself is a product of his past. He forms himself by a series of denials and refusals, but he continues to be haunted by the realities that he has refused and denied. So, in some sense, we today are also living through this kind of a friction. We continue to deny or attempt to abolish or refuse to acknowledge the reality of jatis, but it lingers in our cultural memory. And through this talk, the attempt is really made to understand this cultural diversity as seen in the interrelationships between various jatis then and now. And a particular focus is really put onto those jatis that narrate Kula Puranas or Jati Puranas or Vritti Puranas, which is the Puranas tied around to the professions. And there is a whole ecosystem of what is called upakulalu in Telugu, or subcastes or subjatis. And there is also this ecosystem of what is called the ashrita kulalu, or dependent castes or satellite castes. Really, what these jatis do here is that you have one particular jati, say let's say a jati which is tied around the profession of weaving. It's called padmashalis in the Telangana state. So the Padmashali jati will have another jati which narrates its Puranas. That jati, let's say, it's called a Kunapuli, which is another jati in Telangana. Now, the Kunapuli jati comes and narrates the stories for the Padmashali jati, and in this process, they also become clients of another jatis, which is called the Nakashis or the Nakshi jatis. they build all the scroll paintings, which are in turn used by the Kunapuli Jati when they narrate the Markandeya Purana, which forms a very important part of the cultural memory for the Padmashali caste. So you'd see that there is this wide web of interrelationships between various kinds of jatis belonging to various kinds of professions. Now, a lot of the content that I refer to in this talk is really drawn from the field work and research done by several professors, particularly from the Telugu states, and a lot of other information that is available, let's say, in memoirs, in biographies, in autobiographies, and so on. Again, predominantly the sources are Telugu because I am referring to the Telangana state here. But as I mentioned early on, you can find parallels of this all across the country. One can even look at the work done by IGNCA, which is Indira Gandhi, the National Center for Arts. They have done a lot of documentation on this aspect. And even otherwise, one can see a lot of references to Jati Puranas and Kula Puranas across the states, as I mentioned early on in the talk. Now, the reason why we need to get onto these sources to understand our past is really what the Gandhian historian Dharampal ji he captured this beautifully, which is where he said this, that the real work of knowing India as it has been through the centuries would only start when we begin to look at the material in Indian languages. So you need to really get into the content in Indian languages, in the Indian lived memories, be it oral narratives, be it the memories of people who are surviving today, carrying all these ancestral traditions, and people who have written and produced work in Indian languages, so on. The reason why this is so also is because a lot of the times people who generate content and write content in English in the academia, they have their own biases and they have their own agendas, one would say perhaps. But when you get into the lived experiences of people, you can perhaps make an attempt to understand past without having preconceived notions and judging them. So that's the reason why for a lot of this talk, I'm going to rely on content that is really in Telugu. So we have an arrangement called an Ashrita Kulam. Ashrita Kulam can be translated as a dependent or an interdependent jati vyavastha between multiple jatis, as I mentioned. You would find this kind of a pairing all across multiple jatis in Telangana. And there are also some jatis which are common to all other jatis and narrate common Puranas all across, or let's say stories from Mahabharata, Ramayana, so on. So this kind of a bond is something that really spans through generations. And there are a lot of these jatis which have their relationships with other patron jatis, and their bonding is kind of etched even in their Puranas and in their origin stories, so on. And the dating of all this also, while historians and Indologists may attempt to put a particular date on this, if you look at the way these jatis have stitched their own narratives, they all typically have divine origins. They go back to stories of Shiva, of Parvati, of Vishnu, of Brahma, and of centuries that go like eons and eons ago. So this is a relationship that is sacralized by these Puranas and by these narratives. And performance and patronizing of these stories, they become part of a living ritual. And when you look at these now, trying to understand, when we say they are interdependent jatis, who is dependent on whom also makes for a very interesting thought. Because my identity as a particular jati is coming from the narration that is being done by another jati. So my identity is dependent on them, and their identity as my narrator is also dependent on me. And there is some other caste which is providing the artifacts for all these, let's say in terms of scroll paintings, in terms of musical instruments, in terms of masks, in terms of other paintings, so on. Their identity is dependent on this relations between our both jatis. So if you look at this kind of a relationship between jatis, you'd really look at it as a mesh or an intermesh of multiple such relationships. Now let me give an example of how this kind of worked out. So there is this particular jati called Veera Mushtivaru in Telugu. So this Veera Mushti jati is a particular jati which narrates the stories for one particular jati in the which you can broadly call it as a part of the Vaishya Varna. This is called the Komati jati. So the Komatis, the stories of the Komatis are narrated by the Veera Mushti jati. And the Veeramushti Jati has a relationship with the temple rituals and festivals of Vasavi Kanyaka Parameshwari, who is the Kuladevata of this particular Vaishya community. So you have these documented evidence of the Veeramushti Jati visiting these patron Jatis of the Komati or the Vaishya community, and they have registers, and they maintain who visited me, whom, and at what point in time. They have documentation of the periodicities. Are they coming once in 3 months, once in 6 months, once in 12 months, so on. And these Viramushti Jati agents or the participants in that particular ritual, these people also have what is called a mirasi right or a hereditary right, which gives them access to a set of villages, a set of families, so on. So it is something like they get some sort of a documentary evidence. It can be a copper plate, it can be another form of an inscription or a shasana, which says that you, as the Viramushti Jati, are authorized as the official narrator of memory or cultural memory for this particular set of families in this particular village and this particular village, so on. So it's a kind of an elaborately structured arrangement where one particular jati becomes they become the historians, and they become the carriers of cultural memory for another set of jatis. These narratives typically they follow a format where there is a story of Katha Ganam, which is a story which is woven into the epics, into the Puranas, and into our gods like Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu. These are the kind of origin stories that are tied up to these jatis. And there is also the aspect of Vamsha Vruksham, which is your lineage or family uh, hereditary story of your ancestors and their ancestors and their ancestors, so on. There is also a rich oral and visual performative tradition around how this whole thing is constructed. Now, each of these jatis would only recite the tale of its own parent jati or the patron jati. And that's the kind of elaborate arrangement that one would see when they try to understand the actual practice of how jatis evolved in various states in the country. Now, the Viramushti Jati, you would also see that today when we think of these jatis, they are typically portrayed as people who are very poor, who are downtrodden, and who are possibly disenfranchised. And in some cases, because of the British rules, they've also been treated as these nomadic and denotified tribes, so on. There's a lot of literature on what happened to all of these jatis during the colonial era. But if you look at inscriptional evidence that is available, let's say as recent as the 16th century, you'd actually find that these Viramushti Jatis, they were authorized to get some money from their patron Jatis, and these Viramushti Jatis had actually gone ahead and donated these monies to their local temples. So you'd actually see inscriptional evidence where they are saying that this much of amount has been donated by this particular Viramushti Jati for this particular temple. Now, if you just step back and think of this, why would anybody even donate money to a temple if they are starving, if they are disenfranchised, and if they don't have any money, or if they're barely making any living? And that's really the picture that is important for all of us to introspect on, to understand what was the best state of these jatis, and at what point in time how did they flourish. That's really what we need to focus our energies on when we are trying to engage with our past. One would find a similar kind of a evidence even for, let's say, a jati like a Dommari jati. Dommari again is a Telugu jati which is known for doing their acrobatic activities and gymnast kind of activities on the streets. They're also singers, and they do multiple activities. You could find this kind of jatis again all across the country. Now, again, even here, you would find shasanas or inscriptions of the 16th century from the Vijayanagara kingdom, so on, where these jatis again had donated a certain set of money to temples. So again, the question there comes back that if somebody is just a street acrobat doing some kind of rope tricks and things like that, or just dancing to drum beats, how come they were so rich that they could even donate to temples? So these are again areas that perhaps need more attention from common public who are interested on such topics. You could find references to these in academia journals, but really these are not things that a common Hindu typically today studies, because these aspects of jatis are pretty much brushed aside, and they're not really in our textbooks, they're not really in our mainstream narratives. Our mainstream narrative, as I said at the start, is of this pyramid of one particular caste sitting on top and all other castes sitting in the bottom, so on. But the reality of jatis, if you look at it, it's very, very complicated, and it is really very difficult to fit in one particular figure or one particular architecture and attribute it to that particular system. Now, Before I delve deeper into a specific jati and how it operate, let me take an opportunity to quote Professor Venkatrao from the FLU University, who has done some great work on this particular topic. So he says this in one of his books, that if there is a single practice that moves across in time and space, vertically and horizontally on the Indian cultural weave, it is a practice that is repeatedly affirmed throughout. It is the practice of bhiksha or bhiksham. So if you look at how these jatis operate, a lot of them have a relationship of a bhiksha or a tyagam between them both. So today, when we, for example, think of the idea of bhiksha or somebody giving something to someone, we have this imagery of a poor Brahmin taking some money from somebody, and then we also have people today mocking that aspect that these Brahmins are just coming there and begging alms from us, so on. But if you actually look at the practicing aspect, you'd see that Bhiksha was actually something that was deemed very, very sacred by everybody who participated in that particular rituals. And this is not just something between, let's say, some particular jati and between the Brahmins. If you look at how the jati actually operated, you'd see that there were a plethora of jatis which were operating as jatis that were surviving on Bhiksha in exchange for what they offer, which is the ritual aspects, which is the narration, the art, and the whole origin stories, the narration around Jati Puranas, so on. So these jatis that I'm talking about now, a lot of them have this relationship with their patron jatis on Bhiksha, on Tyagam, so on. So let me give a detailed description of a specific jati um, relationship here so that we can understand this topic better. Now, there is one artifact which is quite popular, used across jatis in the Telangana, is the artifact of scroll paintings, or what is called the Patam Chitram. And there is a particular place in Telangana, a particular village called Cheriyal, where this is quite popular, and it's also called Cheriyal paintings today in our popular discourse. And there are a particular class of artist jatis who are called the Nakashi or Nakshi Jati, and they do these paintings, which are in turn used by multiple other jatis in their own narrative traditions. So this particular jati called the Nakashi Jati, they provide the artifacts for other performing jatis to narrate the Kula Puranas for their patrons. For example, you have a Purana called the Madelu Puranam, which is something that is narrated by a certain jati for the sake of Rajakas, which is the washerman caste. And you have the Purana called Jamba Puranam, which is narrated by a particular jati called Dakalis, and they narrated it for another jati called Madigas. As I mentioned early on, you have the Purana called Markandeya Puranam, which is narrated by a jati called Punapuli and narrated for the jati of Padmashali. So the this jati of Nakshi or Nakashi artists, what they do is they build the artifacts which are used by all these other jatis. So they build these patam chitrams or scroll paintings which are used by all these other jatis. So the way this relationship works is that one of these narrative jatis, they approach the Nakashi jati saying that either the scroll that I am using is now outdated, it needs a replacement, or I'm starting afresh and I need a new scroll to be made. And then the Nakashi jati, they choose a particular auspicious day to begin their work, and they pray to their kuladevata, which is Nimishambika Devi in this particular case, in case of Telangana. And they seek blessings of Nimishambika before they begin work, and then they do a sequencing on when to draw what. For example, the eyes of the Kula Devatas or the Devis and Devatas that show up in these paintings, they are typically drawn in the end because that kind of gives life to the scroll or life to the Patam Chitram. So there's a lot of intricate process and ritual involved in how these scroll paintings come to life. And there is a lot of back and forth between these two jatis also, because when a particular jati comes and says, I want you to do a scroll of this particular Purana, the Nakashi jati, which is doing the painting, may or may not know enough about the Purana. So you have this jati that belongs to the narrative tradition, which comes and sits with these Nakashi artists, and they explain that this is the storyline of my Purana, and this is what I want. And then the Nakashi artists, they imagine it on their own, and that whole thing comes to life on a scroll painting. So this is a process which perhaps today one can see today in case of how movies are made, in case of how storyboarding is done, so on. So you can think of it as a storyboarding ritual of how our own scroll paintings were done in the past. Now again, here while there is these troika or three kind of jatis, where you have a jati which is narrating the Purana, a jati which is consuming the Purana, and a jati which is building artifacts for that Purana. You also have other jatis which are coming in the process to supply, let's say, the raw material for some of this. So to give an example, these Nakashi artists who build, who do the scroll painting, they use a variety of brushes for the painting process. So some of the brushes, for example, they need the hair from the tail of a squirrel. And if you are familiar with how the living experience of the jatis operated, there was a subset of jatis called the Sanchara jatis who used to roam around multiple villages from one place to another, carrying various artifacts. So you used to have a set of Sanchara jatis who are actually helping the Nakashi jatis in terms of giving these raw material, be it the hair of a squirrel, the hair of a goat, or things like that. So you can think of the dependencies that are meshed over generations between these kind of requirements that emerge as a part of the Jati Purana narrative. And again, there is another narrative here where some people, some scholars or academicians, if you'd say, they try to narrate this with another lens to say that these jatis, they're all subaltern jatis, and this is a culture that has been built as a resistance against a Brahminical kind of a dominance or a Brahminical kind of a narrative. Be that as it may, that perhaps may be one perspective, but you could also see again counter examples for this, where you can see these kind of jatis that are doing their work. They actually consult a Brahmin to set the muhurat of when they should start, when they should end, so on. And you'll also see this kind of a patron jati kind of a relationship, even with Brahmins on both sides. So sometimes Brahmins also had become the narrators of some particular set of Puranas, and they were also the patrons for a different kind of jati ecosystem. So as I mentioned, it's very difficult to fix all of this into a binary. So it is perhaps better for us to first engage with all of this deeply and then try to categorize or judge on how that whole thing operated. How the Nakashi Jatis built all these scroll paintings. You have a whole bunch of narrative Jatis who are dependent on the Nakashi Jatis for building these scroll paintings. For example, you have a Jati called Addapollu or Addapusingalu. This is a jati which narrates the story of Nai Brahmins. Nai Brahmins, as they call themselves, these are popularly the caste that does the work of barbers in villages. And Addapollu or Addapusingalu do the narrative story of specific Jati Puranas that are meant for the Nai Brahmins. Similarly, as I mentioned early on, you have the Kunapuli Varu, the Kunapuli Jati, who narrate the Markandeya Puranam for the Padmashalis. And you have the Madelu Puranam, which is narrated for the Rajaka Jati or the washerman Jati by somebody called the Machayalu. This is another Jati which narrates the Jati Puranas for the Rajaka Jati. You have another Jati called Kaki Padagala. This is a Jati which narrates the Jati Puranam and the stories from Mahabharatam, so on, for another Jati called Mudiraj. And you have another Jati called Manda Hechulavaru. The Manda Hechulavaru, they narrate the story for Yadava Jatis, or particularly focused on those Jatis who are into rearing sheep or the shepherd caste. And you have another Jati called Pekarlu. These Pekaru Jati, they narrate the story for Kumaris, who are the potters. So as you can see, like there are each of these professional jatis, and for each of these professional jatis there is another jati which is narrating their Jati Puranas. So while in other states you may not see the exact kind of arrangements, you would have enough evidence, let's say, of scroll paintings or patam chitras being used, let's say, in Orissa, in West Bengal, in Gujarat, so on, for various other Jati Puranas. So the way this whole thing operates is that the Indian experience is not really a textual experience, where if somebody asks, why is this jati a patron for this jati, show me the evidence, where is it written, in which book is it written, is it the first Veda or is the second Veda? It is very difficult to find any of these references in that way, because the Hindu experience is really about these lived realities and less about the textual reality. While the textual reality might have its play, there is a lot of narration and context setting that happens dynamically through generations of lived experiences. and the Jati Puranas and the Jati narratives really need to be seen within that sort of a dynamic, ever-changing lived experiences. Now, let me spend some time to explain one particular Jati Purana here, so that that kind of contextualizes the kind of the Jati Purana narratives that each of these Jatis do when they go on their performing art or a narrative kind of a tradition. So I'll focus on the particular Jati Purana that is narrated by the Kunapuli Jati for the Padmashali Jati, which is the Markandeya Purana. Now, the Padmashali Jati has, or one of the key professions they have, is that of weaving. And if you look at this particular Jati Purana or the Markandeya Puranam, you'd find questions being posed very specific to the profession of weaving. So there are questions on, there are these doubts or concerns on what clothes will our Devis and Devatas wear, and who's going to provide for all of that. And it's kind of from those questions and contexts that a new profession kind of emerges. So if you look at the Markandeya Puranam, it starts with the Srishti, which is how the whole creation came to be. And you have the story of Bhrigu Maharshi and Mrukanda Maharshi. And there is a story of how Markandeya is born to Maradvati. And then Markandeya is born as a Alpayush, which is he doesn't have a lot of Ayush, which is a lot of lifespan. And then he performs a penance. And through the penance, by getting a boon from Lord Shiva, he becomes a Chiranjeevi. And then Markandeya marries Dhumravati, and Bhavana Rishi is somebody who is born for this couple. And Bhavana Rishi really becomes like the patron god or the Rishi for this particular Padmashali Jati. So the Bhavana Rishi then asks the gods, what should I do after I grow up? So then Vishnu, Mahavishnu, the Lord Vishnu, he teaches this Vidya of weaving to Bhavana Rishi. Because if you look at the imagery or the popular depiction of how the memory of Lord Vishnu is etched into our own cultural memory, you have him lying down on the Seshatalpa, and then you have this lotus that is emerging from his nabi or navel, and from that lotus you have the image of Brahma. So it is this imagery that is used in this particular Markandeya Purana to explain the birth of a particular profession. So from that, the lotus reeds that are emerging from the navel of Sri Mahavishnu, from those reeds, the threads are made, and from those threads, they are then used to weave clothes by Bhavana Rishi. So you can see how clothing as a profession now suddenly becomes sacred. It has these divine origins. It is not your dull, mundane operation that is happening. It is, in fact, a very sacred operation now. And now, the Purana this way goes that Bhavana Rishi then starts weaving clothes for all the Devatas, and then there is a fight with Asuras that emerges, and Bhavana Rishi then fights with the Asuras with the help of others. And from the blood stains of the Asuras, the weight threads that have been given by Lord Mahavishnu, they also attain colors. So this is a kind of explanation being given to how the colors of various threads that are used during weaving, how that particular colors have emerged. Now, Bhavana Rishi then tries to give these clothes to each of the devatas. So he goes one after the other, and then in the end he goes to Kalabhairava, and then he says, "Here, take your clothes." And then Kalabhairava then becomes angry, saying that, how dare you give clothes to me in the end after every other devata is done. And so he curses, saying that your clothes are not going to stay forever, and they are going to perish once in 3 months or once in 6 months, and they need to be replaced. So again here you'd see that there is an explanation emerging for the kind of professional acts that happen in weaving, where you weave a cloth and then the cloth is worn out and then you need to weave one more cloth. So this is a kind of explanation of how things came to be this way. And the explanation is given by using the characters of Bhavana Rishi, Kala Bhairava, Lord Mahavishnu, so on. Now, again, here, moving on this particular Purana, process of distributing the Vastras that Bhavana Rishi has now started, he then goes to Lord Shiva, saying that these are the clothes that I have woven. And Lord Shiva rejects them, saying that I don't want this kind of cloth, and I want something that is made out of tiger skin. So if you look at the popular imagery again of Lord Shiva. You'd see him associated with tiger skin, and it's the in this Purana you would see how that is kind of being stitched into this particular narrative. So now Bhavana Rishi then has to get tiger skin. So he has to take over the tigers from Bhadravati. Bhadravati is the daughter of sun god, and she is the command for all the tigers on the land. So Bhavana Rishi then gets the tigers from Bhadravati. And in this process, Narada, who is known for inciting quarrels, even in the, I mean, albeit in the cause of Dharma, but he is known as somebody who incites trouble in Puranas and in folklore. So Narada, what he does here is he incites a particular Asura, Kaluva Asura, to obstruct this attempt by Bhavana Rishi to take over the tigers from Bhadravati. And then a fight emerges. And in this process, Bhavana Rishi is tired, and from his sweat, as he is doing the battle, from that sweat, a new jiva emerges, and that jiva is the Kunapuli Jati. And this Kunapuli Jati is the one who is now going to narrate this Markandeya Purana for the future. And all of the instruments that the weavers use, the looms or what is called Maggam in Telugu, these looms are now built with the body parts of the Asuras who have just been slayed. So this is a kind of very complicated enmeshed narrative where the birth of a profession is explained and the birth of a narrative jati is explained, and how the instruments that are needed or used by the profession, they are explained. All of this is done within the contours or within the bounds of our devis and devatas and what happened in their lives. So this is a very typical example of how these Jati Puranas came to be. And then if you look at how this continues, so once the looms are created and once the Kunapuli Jati is also created to as a narrated Jati, then eventually Bhavana Rishi marries Bhadravati and they beget children. And as the narrative goes, they beget 101 children. And each of these 101 children start of a lineage of Gotras. So there are about 101 Gotras for the Padmashali or the Weaver caste, and all of them kind of tie back to this particular Jati Purana. So these kind of Jati Puranas are narrated by the performing artists. They go village to village, family to family. Whoever has the right to listen and whoever they have the right to express this Purana to, they narrate these stories, and that's how people used to participate in this kind of a Jati Purana kind of a aspect. Now, as I mentioned, you would find this as a common pattern that is followed across Jati Puranas. It's a pattern of sacralizing work. So it's some way of explaining the mundane as sacred, and you'd see that this kind of is giving an explanation for people of why they are doing what they are doing, and also how things fit into a master narrative. So this motif of people who are born out of sweat is something that is somebody can also find in another Jati Puranas, which is that of Rajakas or washermen as a Jati. So you have this story of Daksha Yagna, which is something again very popular involving Daksha, Shiva, and Parvati. So you have Daksha Yagna happening, and then Lord Shiva is angry. That's how the story goes, and then he sends Veerabhadra, who is born out of the Jata Jutta of Lord Shiva, which is Veerabhadra is born out of the hair of Lord Shiva, and he's sent to destroy the Daksha Yagna. And in this story, you'd see that this particular Purana, Jati Purana, that is narrated for the Rajakas by the Machaya Jati, you'd see that from the sweat of Veerabhadra in this process, two people are born. One is Madelaya, who becomes the Kula Devata of the Rajaka Jati, and another is the Machaya, who becomes the narrator of all these Puranas. So in this story, one would see the sacralization of the task of Rajaka or a washerman. That kind of a pattern is something that you could see across professions. And very interestingly, one can also find these kind of narratives in some other pagan cultures, so to say, as well, across the world. Now, while this is one part of the aspect of how the origin stories of these jatis have emerged, and how the narrators of these jatis have come up, and how this whole intermesh of relationship has come up, there is another aspect of how in practice this created a whole new set of jatis. So here I'd like to take the example of how the musical instruments that these jatis carry as a part of this performing art, how these musical instruments themselves are unique, and how there are stories associated with professional jatis that have expertise in making these instruments. So, for example, there is a musical instrument called kinnera. This kinnera is something one can think of as, let's say, as a sitar kind of an instrument. And this kinnera is an instrument that is used by a particular jati when they try to narrate a particular Purana.
అమ్మబాయి గడ్డ కాడ దొంగలుండ దోన పండ బొమ్మ మేడు చెట్టి కింద పండిండమ్మ మీయ సావు ఇద్దరి పెట్టు రొమ్మున్నది.
So you have the Dakkalis who narrate the Jati Purana for Madigas, and the Dakkalis are known to use a particular kind of kinnera when they narrate that particular Jati Purana. So if you look at how this instrument called kinnera has come to be, there is a lot of literature available on how various natural resources are procured from the forests, and how the strings are made, and how the instrument needed to produce the sound, how those are made, how the drums are made. When these instruments were made, these particular jatis which are creating these instruments, they needed access to forests, and there are a lot of rare forest ingredients that were required to manufacture all of these instruments. And you can find this play out across jatis. For example, there is a particular jati called Mithula Ayavarlu, who are a performing jati for malas, which is another jati, and they have instrument called the kaddi vadyam, which is a particular kind of a veena. And these Mithula Ayavarlu, they use this veena when they are performing for the mala jati, and they sing songs from the Vaishnava tradition and Dharampuri Ramayan, so on. So each of these performing jatis, when they are carrying their musical instruments, there is a story behind those musical instruments as well, of which jati is supplying them for raw material for those, and which jati is making those musical instruments, so on. Again, to quote more examples here, there is another instrument called a burra veena, which is a form of veena which is used by the Mala Dasari community, which is another community of you can think of them as traveling artists, or traveling members who are carrying cultural memory and exposure to ritual spaces, singing songs, so on.
సీతమ్మ నడిగేను సౌరంగా మరి వెంక వెదకి చూసేను సీత. దీని పేరు బుర్రవీణ అంటారు సార్. బుర్రవీణ అనేది ఇది కాయ చెట్టుకు పడుతుంది కాయ ఇది.
You have another art form called the Oggu Katha, which is again done by a particular jati, and they use an instrument called an Oggu. How this jati which is narrating the Oggu Katha involves with multiple other people and multiple other places in trying to build these kind of instruments. You can find this kind of stories across multiple jatis. So the Budapukkala jati, which is one jati which roams around villages narrating popular tradition, they use their own instruments. There is another jati called Bala Santulavaru, which use their own instruments. There is a jati called Goravaya, which is a performing artist class spread across Karnataka, Maharashtra, Telangana. They have their own instruments. There is a jati called Runjavaru. The Runja jati, they have a kind of drum which is very unique to them, a percussion instrument, a big kind of percussion instrument which they use as when they narrate the Puranas for the Vishwakarma jati. And you have Terachiralavaru, which is a sub-jati for Yadavas or the shepherd jati, and they have a percussion instrument called Viranalu. So these Terachiralavaru, as they use patams or scrolls to narrate, they also use these musical instruments. So this is a very, very complicated ecosystem of how each of these jatis used to talk to each other. There is a responsibility of narrating Puranas. There is a responsibility of performing a particular art at a particular time in a particular fashion, and it is quite complicated, and it's very difficult to understand these in a typical Indologist colonial kind of a lens, where we were all told that they were just these three or four varnas, and how these three or four varnas is based on so and so text. But if you look at how the practicing reality of jatis has emerged, it is very, very fascinating in terms of how that got enriched, and how new jatis get created, old ones die, how new traditions get created, how new art forms get created, how new instruments get created, so on. So the attempt here through this talk has really been to explain some of these intricacies. And let me also quote from my own personal experience, where I happened to visit a particular conference that has been organized by Professor Jaideep Tirmal Rao, who has done great work in documenting some of these Jati Puranas and these art forms, the narrative traditions in all of these jatis. So I happened to talk to some of the last surviving practitioners of a particular jati who narrate Puranas, and they are also known for one particular musical instrument that they own. They are kind of the only owners of that particular instruments in all of India at that point in time. This was, let's say, a couple of years ago. So when I talked to them, I asked them that you have this hereditary tradition, and now a lot of things are changing. Nobody is really practicing their own hereditary professions. What are you going to do to ensure that this particular art form survives and it kind of transmits to the next few generations? And that person, the artist, was kind of taken aback, and he was borderline angry on me for asking that kind of a question, because he said that that particular tradition that he is in charge of, and those particular musical instruments that he is in charge of, he says that's a very very core part of his identity, and he's going to fight till his last breath to ensure there is continuity. So he explicitly told me that I'll teach this to my sons, even if they take to some other professions. I'm going to make sure that even like when there's a holiday, when there's a weekend or whatever it is, they are going to learn this profession. Let's say for whatever reason my sons and my progeny, they don't spend enough time on it, then I'm going to tap onto my relatives. If not my relatives, I'll go to the nearby villages. This is not something that I'm going to let go of that easily, because this is my kula gauravam, which is that is the pride of my particular jati. So while we may have a lot of hard opinions today on heredity and hereditary practices, the reality is that a lot of these jatis and a lot of these narrative traditions, they were hereditary, and they carried forward like this because of the people like this artist I spoke to, who really spend their entire life in trying to nurture these art forms, practice them, and also ensure that they continue. So the question that we need to perhaps pose to ourselves is that as these hereditary paramparas are breaking, are we creating alternative institutions that can do this job of nurturing these particular traditions and transmitting this further? Now, let me take one last example here to also quote a story of a particular jati, which I personally found very interesting as I was trying to learn this subject better. Now, typically, as I mentioned early on in the talk, that when you read some of this literature, there is one narrative that is constant by a lot of the academicians who narrate this, which is to say that this is a kind of subaltern culture, which is very different from Brahminical culture. And this is perhaps a different kind of a Hinduism as compared to Vedic Hinduism, so on. Now, of course, as you have clearly seen, all of the Jati Puranas really are about the same Vedic gods, if you were to use the term, or the same Puranic gods of Shiva, of Parvati, of Vishnu, of Brahma, so on. So, that itself stands on a shaky ground when people are saying that this is a particular tradition that is a subaltern tradition which is different from Hindu tradition. Be that as it may, you can keep that aside for a moment. The example that I'm quoting here is about a particular jati which is called the Ganuga or the Ganika jati. The Ganuga jati is really a jati that is into the production and sale of oil. So they are also called the Gandla community, and this is a community that you can find in um, Karnataka and the Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, so on. And you'd also have the equivalent kind of a tradition all across India, because making and selling and making oil is something that has very old origins, and that's a jati that is prevalent all across the country. So in this particular case, you have this particular jati called the Gandla jati, and this particular jati has a Kula Purana which is called the Manu Vamshaja Charitam, and this Manu Vamshaja Charitra has been written by a Brahmin, and that Brahmin is also the Kula Guru of this particular jati. So you have this jati which is on its own, nothing to do with Brahminical tradition, so to say. but then there is a Brahmin who is also the Kulaguru here. And in this particular case, the Kulaguru needs to be from one particular lineage, which is the Sripati Pandita Rajula lineage. So the Pandita Rajula lineage is really related to the whole tradition of how Aradhya Shaiva Shaka has emerged. So it's a Shaka called Shrauta Shaivam. So if you look at the history of how Shaiva or the whole Shaiva and Virashaiva traditions have emerged in the Telugu states over time, you would find that there were three acharyas, Sripati Pandita and Mallikarjuna, and then um, other such. And these acharyas were lingadaris, and some of these castes, in this case, the Ganugakas, they are also lingadaris. So if you look at how the Brahminical Kula Guru is now tied up to this particular caste, you can see that the Lingadari tradition or the Shaiva tradition is something that is tying them together both. Now, if you look at the Kula Purana of this particular caste, again, you would see here that how they tie themselves back to Lord Shiva's Jata Juta, or the matted hair of Lord Shiva, to Vishwakarma, so on. Now, in this particular case, what makes this story all the more interesting for me and for many other people uh, from the Telugu states and even outside is that the Kulaguru in this case was Sri Sambamurti Garu, who is the father of S.P. Balasubramaniam, the very popular singer in movies. So you have Sri Sambamurti Garu, who belongs to that particular Pandita Radhya lineage, and he then becomes the Kulaguru of a caste which is really involved into making and selling oil. So this is a very complicated narrative, and these kind of stories are there perhaps in pockets in some books here and there, and some lived memories. But we are not seen. We don't see these stories that often, and we are not shown these stories that often because they don't fit into that narrative we have of trying to draw a pyramid and saying this caste is the oppressed, this caste is the oppressor, and that relationship is set in stone, and they are always the same. So if you look at relationships like these, it is very difficult to straitjacket them into any of these kind of labels. So if you look at each of these traditions, of course, there is the grand march of modernity, and a lot of these traditions are now vanishing. In some cases, they are morphing into some other forms. For example, the Nakashi artists, the Jati that I referred to early on in the talk, while at one point there were perhaps drawing the scroll paintings related to Puranas, now maybe they are drawing the paintings that are related to village scenery and very secular kind of paintings, as they say today. Or they may be doing one odd painting related to Jati Purana, but maybe they have also moved on to other kind of traditions. So it is challenged. A lot of these surviving traditions are challenged by modernity, and as a people, we need to kind of understand the costs of this process of what is it that we had, what is it that we are losing, is it worth to preserve, which part of it is worth to preserve, and which institution can today preserve that and nurture that kind of a tradition in the absence of a hereditary transmission. So maybe can the humanities departments in our universities, can they really step up in trying to construct this master narrative, like instead of trying to say one version of history, can they really capture the diversity we had across all of these Jati Puranas all across the country? Can they do that? I think these are kind of questions that should trigger people who are curious about understanding their cultural past, conserving it, and nurturing it for the future. As I mentioned, the challenge here is also not just of a loss. The challenge here is also that of us not even knowing that we are losing something. Hope that more people will try to engage with all of these jati traditions, these performative artist traditions, try to understand their own sense of cultural past and not go by one particular narrative in one particular textbook or anything like that, and try to be open, not be judgmental, spend time to understand each of these Jati Puranas and the interrelationships between these jatis, get a particular image of the society of the past, how things operated before all of these disruptions that were brought forth by modernity happened. And then perhaps we can kind of figure out what needs to be done with all of this, and how do we ensure that we have a balanced, a more balanced sense of past, instead of having the current sense of past, where a lot of it is really filled with guilt, filled with disgust, and filled with disdain, where we are thinking of our past, as I mentioned, of full of oppression, full of discrimination, and nothing really to feel proud of. And anything in the past is perhaps outdated, and nothing is there to carry forward. So, amidst all that kind of a negativity that emerges as one consumes popular media on traditions, the attempt here has been to create an alternative narrative, which is to understand how things were in practice. Don't go with any preconceived notions. Don't judge any of this. Understand how it was first, and then perhaps form your opinions. But when you are doing the journey of trying to understand, perhaps it's not right to carry a lot of these baggages in terms of oppressed, oppressor, discrimination, and so on. So thank you. Thanks to Atharva Forum for giving me this opportunity to discuss this underappreciated aspect of our cultural past. And don't forget to subscribe to the Atharva Forum. Thank you.